Hell's Angel mistook little garbage picker for thief, only to discover she was his daughter. Tears of regret. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Frank Lawson's mansion, casting long shadows across the marble floor of his dining room. Frank sat alone at the massive mahogany table, his breakfast barely touched. His large frame, covered in faded tattoos, seemed out of place among the refined furnishings. He wrapped his calloused hands around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. The silence of the house pressed in on him, broken only by the distant tick of an antique grandfather clock. 20 years of success had bought him everything money could buy, but the emptiness remained. Frank's gaze drifted to a small photo frame lying face down on a nearby shelf. He'd knocked it over last night during one of his darker moments. The frame held a wedding photo, him and Rebecca on their happiest day. He hadn't looked at it in years, but he didn't need to. The image was burned into his memory. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Should have done better, he muttered to himself, his voice rough from disuse. The words echoed in the empty room. The newspaper beside his plate lay unopened. These days, he barely bothered with it. What was the point? His business empire ran itself, and he had no one to share the news with anyway. The staff kept their distance. He made sure of that. Easier that way. Safer. A ray of sunlight caught his eyes, making him squint. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see his manicured lawns stretching toward the iron gates that marked his property line. The gardens were perfect, sterile, just like everything else in his life. Frank pushed away his untouched eggs and toast. His appetite had been gone for days now. The dreams were getting worse. Memories of his time with the gang, of Rebecca's tears the night she left, of all the calls he'd ignored over the years. Movement at the edge of his property caught his eye. Frank leaned forward, his massive frame tensing. There by the garbage bins near the service entrance, a small figure was moving. A child, from the looks of it, digging through his trash. "What the hell?" he growled, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. The sound echoed through the empty room. His first reaction was pure rage. How dare anyone trespass on his property? He'd built these walls, installed the security systems, hired the guards, all to keep the world out, to keep his solitude intact. The girl, he could see now it was a young girl, continued rummaging through his garbage, completely unaware she was being watched. Her clothes were shabby, her hair unkempt. She pulled something from the bin and stuffed it into a worn backpack. Frank's jaw clenched. He pressed the intercom button on the wall with more force than necessary. "Johnson," he barked at his head of security. "We got an intruder at the west gate. Some kid going through the trash. Want us to escort her out, sir?" Johnson's voice crackled through the speaker. Frank watched the girl for another moment. Something about her seemed familiar, but he pushed the thought away. He couldn't afford to feel anything. Feeling led to weakness, and weakness led to pain. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. "Deal with her," he ordered, his voice cold and final. Through the window, he saw two of his security guards emerge from their station, moving with purpose toward the girl. Gravel crunched under heavy boots as Vince and Tom sprinted down the winding driveway. The girl's head snapped up at the sound, her eyes going wide with fear. She clutched her worn backpack to her chest and bolted toward the iron gates. From his position at the window, Frank watched the chase unfold. The girl was quick, darting between the perfectly trimmed hedges like a rabbit. His security team, built more for intimidation than speed, struggled to keep up with her nimble movements. Got her cornered now, Frank muttered to himself, noting how the girl had taken a wrong turn toward the garden wall. His chest tightened unexpectedly. Something about her desperate flight stirred uncomfortable memories, times when he'd been the one running, back in his wilder days. The girl's sneakers, held together with duct tape, slipped on the wet morning grass. She stumbled but caught herself, losing precious seconds. Vince, the younger of the two guards, was closing the gap. His heavy breathing carried across the morning air. "Stop right there," Tom shouted, his voice echoing across the grounds. The girl only ran faster, her tangled hair streaming behind her. Frank pressed his palm against the cool window glass. The scene before him felt surreal, like watching a movie he couldn't quite turn away from. The girl's terror was visible even from this distance. She looked so small compared to his guards, so vulnerable. Vince lunged forward, his fingers grazing the girl's backpack. She jerked away, but the sudden movement sent her sprawling. Her knees hit the gravel hard, and a small cry escaped her lips. Before she could scramble up, Tom's large hands clamped down on her shoulders. "No, please," she begged, her voice high and frightened. "I didn't take anything valuable, I swear." The guards hauled her to her feet. She struggled weakly, but it was useless against their firm grip. Tears cut clean tracks through the dirt on her face. Something fluttered from her hand, a crumpled piece of paper that caught the morning breeze before settling in the grass. Frank turned from the window, his jaw clenched tight. He stalked through the quiet halls of his mansion, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. By the time he reached the front door, anger had replaced his earlier unease. This was his property, his sanctuary. No one had the right to invade it. The morning air hit him as he stepped outside. The girl stood between Vince and Tom, trembling like a trapped animal. Up close, Frank could see how thin she was, how her clothes hung loose on her small frame. Her eyes, red from crying, fixed on him with a mixture of fear and something else he couldn't quite read. "What the hell were you doing on my property?" Frank demanded, his voice coming out as a growl. The girl flinched at his tone, shrinking back against Tom's grip. Her fingers clutched desperately at a dirty scrap of paper she'd managed to hold onto during the chase. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she stared up at the towering figure before her, unable to form words through her terror. Frank loomed over her, his massive frame casting a shadow in the morning sun. "Well," he pressed, his patience wearing thin. "Start talking, kid. Why were you going through my trash?" The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank's manicured lawn as he towered over the trembling girl. Her dirty sneakers shuffled against the gravel, and she clutched that mysterious piece of paper like a lifeline. "I asked you a question," Frank growled, his patience wearing thin. "Why were you?" "Mommy says you're my daddy." The words hung in the air like smoke. Frank's mouth went dry, and the anger that had been burning in his chest moments ago turned to ice. He took an unconscious step backward, his boots suddenly heavy as lead. "What did you say?" His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. The girl's lower lip quivered, but her eyes, a startling shade of blue he hadn't noticed before, stayed locked on his face. "My mom, she told me before she swallowed hard. She said you were my father. She left me this." Her small fingers uncurled from around the crumpled paper. Frank's head spun. Those eyes. He knew those eyes. They were the same shade as Rebecca's, the woman he'd loved and left 15 years ago. Memories he'd buried under years of bitter regret came rushing back. Rebecca's smile, their last fight, the way she tried to tell him something important before he'd stormed out that final time. Vince and Tom exchanged uncomfortable glances, their grip on the girl's shoulders loosening slightly. "Maria." Frank's voice boomed across the lawn, making the girl jump. The housekeeper appeared at the door, her dark eyes taking in the scene with quiet concern. "Maria, come here." Maria hurried down the steps, her practical shoes clicking against the stone. She reached them quickly, her expression softening when she saw the girl's tear-stained face. "Take her." Frank had to clear his throat. "Take her to the guest room. The blue one." He ran a hand over his face, his tattooed knuckles white with tension. "Get her cleaned up and find her something to eat." Maria nodded, already reaching for the girl's hand. "Come with me, Pequena." "What's your name?" "Lily," the girl whispered, glancing uncertainly between Maria's gentle face and Frank's shocked expression. "Lily Lawson." Frank's chest tightened at the surname. His surname. He watched as Maria led Lily toward the house. Her small backpack still clutched to her chest. The morning light caught her hair, light brown, just like Rebecca's had been. "Boss." Tom's gruff voice broke through his thoughts. "What do you want us to do?" "Go back to your posts," Frank muttered, his eyes still fixed on Lily's retreating form. "And give me Roberts on the phone. I need my lawyer. Now." Inside the mansion, Maria showed Lily to the blue guest room, a space that had never felt the warmth of actual guests. Through the large bay window, Lily could see the perfectly maintained gardens where she'd been running just minutes before. Her small hands pressed against the cool glass, her reflection showing a mix of fear and tentative hope in those striking blue eyes. Maria quietly closed the door, leaving Lily alone with her thoughts and the weight of the truth she'd finally delivered. Frank slumped in his leather chair, the morning's events weighing heavily on his shoulders. His office, normally a sanctuary of control and order, felt suffocating. The phone sat on his mahogany desk like a ticking bomb. He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of it all. The girl, Lily, had his name, but that didn't mean anything, did it? His fingers drummed against the desk's polished surface, a nervous habit he thought he'd kicked years ago. Tom's weathered face appeared in the doorway. "Roberts is on standby, boss. Want me to patch him through?" Frank waved him off. "Give me a minute." Memories of Rebecca flooded his mind. Their last fight had been explosive, full of words they couldn't take back. He'd stormed out, engine roaring into the night, never looking back. Pride and anger had kept him away, even when he'd heard through old contacts that she'd tried to reach him. His eyes drifted to an old photo buried under some papers. Him and Rebecca on his bike, both young and carefree. Her blue eyes sparkled with joy, the same eyes he'd seen in Lily's face just hours ago. The girl was 12, maybe 13. The timing, it lined up perfectly with when he'd left. His stomach churned at the thought. "Damn it, Rebecca," he muttered, running his hands through his graying hair. "Why didn't you make me listen?" A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Maria stood in the doorway, her expression gentle but firm. "The little one is settled. She's hungry. I made her some soup." She paused, studying his troubled face. "She has your chin, senor." Frank's jaw clenched. "Maria, don't." In her mother's eyes, Maria continued, undeterred. "Sometimes the truth comes knocking whether we're ready or not." Frank stood abruptly, pacing behind his desk. The tattoos on his arms, remnants of his wilder days, seemed to mock him now. A father? Him? The idea was absurd. He'd spent years building walls around himself, and now this child shows up claiming to be his flesh and blood. But those eyes, Rebecca's eyes. His hand hovered over the phone. One call would start the process. A simple DNA test would tell him the truth. But was he ready for that truth? Ready to face the consequences of his past decisions? Tom appeared again. "Boss, Roberts is getting impatient." Frank's fingers curled into a fist. He'd faced down rival gangs, built a business empire from nothing. But this terrified him more than anything. Maria's words echoed in his head. "Sometimes the truth comes knocking whether we're ready or not." With a deep breath, he picked up the phone. His thumb shook slightly as he pressed the screen to connect the call. "Roberts." His voice came out gruffer than intended. "Yeah, it's Lawson. I need you to arrange something. A paternity test." He paused, listening to his lawyer's response. "Today if possible." "No, I don't care what it costs." He ended the call and sat back down, feeling the weight of what he'd just set in motion. The test would tell him the truth, whether he was ready for it or not. Somewhere upstairs, a little girl with Rebecca's eyes was eating soup, waiting to find out if she'd finally found her father. Frank stood in the doorway of his living room, watching Lily. She sat cross-legged on the plush carpet, hunched over a piece of paper, her small hand moving deliberately as she drew. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, catching her dark hair, just like Rebecca's. His chest tightened. The girl's mannerisms, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, even how she bit her lower lip in concentration. It was all Rebecca. He tried to forget those details over the years, but seeing them now in this child brought everything rushing back. Maria bustled past him with a plate of cookies and a glass of milk. She set them down next to Lily, who looked up with a shy "thank you." The housekeeper gave Frank a meaningful look as she passed him again. "What are you drawing?" Frank asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Lily startled slightly, as if she'd forgotten he was there. She hesitated before answering, "My old house. With Grandma." Frank took a cautious step into the room. The mansion suddenly felt too big, too empty around this small figure. May I see? Lily studied him for a moment, then nodded. Frank moved closer, careful to maintain some distance. The drawing showed a modest house with a tiny garden. A stick figure stood in the window, an older woman, he assumed. That's where we lived before. Lily's voice trailed off. She picked up a blue crayon and started coloring the sky. Before what? Frank asked softly. Before Grandma got sick. Lily's hand stilled. She said I needed to find you, that you'd take care of me. Frank's throat constricted. He'd been so wrapped up in his own shock that he hadn't considered what brought her here. Where's your grandmother now? Hospital. Lily's voice was barely a whisper. She can't take care of me anymore. The doorbell rang, startling them both. Tom's heavy footsteps crossed the foyer, followed by a brief conversation at the door. Mr. Lawson? Tom called. Package for you. Frank's stomach clenched. The test kit. He'd almost forgotten about it in these quiet moments with Lily. I'll be right back, he told her. Tom handed him a plain manila envelope. From Robert's office. Frank nodded, retreating to his study. He sat behind his desk, staring at the envelope. Inside was the truth, a truth that could change everything. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. The papers inside were clinical, full of medical terminology and numbers, but his eyes found the conclusion immediately. The words seemed to pulse on the page. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Frank set the papers down carefully, his vision blurring. Lily was his daughter, his child, the daughter he never knew he had with the woman he'd loved and lost. The magnitude of what he'd missed crashed over him. 12 years of birthdays, first steps, first words. 12 years while his daughter grew up without him, while Rebecca raised their child alone. And now Rebecca was gone, and their daughter had been left with an ailing grandmother. He looked through his study door, where he could still see Lily drawing in the living room. She was his responsibility now, his daughter. The word felt foreign in his mind, but the truth of it settled into his bones with an undeniable weight. His hands were still shaking as he carefully folded the test results and placed them in his desk drawer. Everything was about to change, and for the first time in years, Frank Lawson was terrified. Frank stared at the paternity test results until the words blurred together. The silence of his study pressed in around him, broken only by the gentle ticking of the antique clock on the wall. His fingers traced the edges of the paper, as if touching it might somehow make the reality easier to accept. Rebecca's face floated in his memory, her dark eyes, her gentle smile, the way she'd look at him as if he was worth something. That was before the drinking, before the fights, before he'd chosen the wild freedom of his biker gang over their marriage. He'd been young and stupid, thinking he could have it all, the thrill of the road and a loving wife waiting at home. I'm sorry, Rebecca, he whispered to the empty room. I'm so sorry. He remembered their last fight like it was yesterday. Rebecca, standing in their small apartment, tears streaming down her face, begging him to choose, her or the gang. He'd stormed out, roared away on his motorcycle, too proud to admit he was wrong. By the time he'd come back, days later, she was gone. Frank pulled open his desk drawer and took out an old photo. It was creased and worn, but Rebecca's smile still shone through. They looked so young, so full of hope. She must have been pregnant when she left, carrying their child, Lily, and he never knew. The weight of those lost years crashed over him. 12 birthdays he'd missed. 12 Christmases. First steps, first words, first day of school. All gone because of his foolish pride. A knock at the study door startled him from his thoughts. Maria stood in the doorway, her expression gentle but firm. The girl, Lily, she's in the garden, Maria said. She looks lost, Mr. Lawson, like she's waiting for something. Frank nodded, carefully folding the test results and placing them in his pocket. His legs felt heavy as he stood, each step toward the garden door seeming to take more effort than the last. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the manicured lawn. Lily sat on one of the stone benches near the rose bushes, her small figure dwarfed by the grand surroundings. She was running her finger along the bench's edge, lost in thought. Frank's footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Lily looked up, her dark eyes, Rebecca's eyes, watching him carefully. He lowered himself onto the bench beside her, leaving enough space between them to not seem threatening. "I got the test results back," he said quietly, his gruff voice softer than usual. Lily's fingers stilled on the bench. She didn't look at him, but he could see her holding her breath. "You were telling the truth," Frank continued. I am your father." The words hung in the air between them. Lily slowly turned to face him, her expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. Frank could see the walls she'd built, just like his own, wavering but not yet falling. "I know I wasn't there before," he said, his throat tight. "I made a lot of mistakes, but I want to take responsibility now. I want to try to be—" He paused, the words still feeling foreign on his tongue. "To be your father." Lily's eyes widened, searching his face for any sign of deception. Frank held her gaze, letting her see the truth in his eyes, along with all his fear and regret. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know what being a father means yet, but I want to try, if you'll let me." Frank's Mercedes rumbled down Main Street, the silence inside the car thick and uncomfortable. He glanced at Lily in the passenger seat, her small frame dwarfed by the leather interior. She stared out the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "There's a good ice cream place up ahead," Frank said, his deep voice breaking the quiet. "Best in town, they say." Lily nodded, but didn't speak. Frank tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He'd faced down rival gangs without breaking a sweat, but this 12-year-old girl made him more nervous than any confrontation ever had. The ice cream parlor was a cheerful little place with red and white striped awnings. As they walked in, a bell tinkled above the door. The teenage girl behind the counter smiled brightly. "What can I get for you today?" Frank cleared his throat. "What do you want, kid?" Lily shifted from foot to foot, eyes scanning the flavors behind the glass. "Chocolate chip, please," she said quietly. "Make it 2 scoops," Frank added gruffly. "In a waffle cone." He turned to Lily. "Unless you want something else?" She shook her head, still not meeting his eyes. "And for you, sir?" the server asked. Frank hadn't even thought about what he wanted. "Same thing," he muttered, pulling out his wallet. They sat at a small table by the window. Lily took tiny, careful bites of her ice cream, while Frank's began to melt, dripping onto his hands. He wasn't used to eating ice cream anymore. It had been years since he'd set foot in a place like this. "Is it good?" he asked, watching her eat. "Yes," Lily replied. "Thank you." More silence. Frank wiped his sticky hands with a napkin, feeling completely out of his element. His tattoos drew curious stares from other customers, and he could see parents pulling their children closer as they walked past. "Your mother," he began, then stopped when he saw Lily tense. Did she like ice cream?" Lily's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "She loved mint chocolate chip," she said after a moment. "We used to get ice cream every Friday after school." Her voice grew softer. "Before she got sick." Frank's chest tightened. He hadn't known Rebecca was ill. Another failure to add to his long list. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I should have been there." Lily didn't respond, but her shoulders hunched slightly as she focused on her ice cream. The drive back to the mansion was just as quiet as the trip out. Frank kept sneaking glances at his daughter, trying to see Rebecca in her features. The shape of her eyes, the way she held herself. It was all there, a living reminder of what he'd lost. As they pulled up to the house, Frank caught Lily watching him in his peripheral vision. Her gaze was careful, calculating, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something more than the fear and uncertainty from before. For the first time since the paternity test results, Frank felt a small spark of hope warm his chest. Maybe this awkward afternoon wasn't a complete disaster. Maybe there was still a chance to make things right. The heavy wooden door creaked open as Frank led Lily into one of the mansion's spare bedrooms. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm squares on the plush cream carpet. A king-sized bed dominated the space, its pristine white duvet looking like fresh snow. "This'll be your room," Frank said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. He watched as Lily clutched her small backpack tighter to her chest, her eyes wide as she took in the crystal chandelier the mahogany dresser, and the oversized TV mounted on the wall. Lily stood frozen in the doorway, her worn sneakers leaving slight marks on the polished hardwood floor of the hallway. "It's big," she whispered. Frank scratched his beard, suddenly aware of how overwhelming this must be for her. "We can make it smaller if you want. Move some furniture around or something." Lily shook her head and took a tentative step inside. Her hand brushed against the silk curtains, and she quickly pulled back as if afraid she might damage them. "The bathroom's through there." Frank pointed to a door on the left. "It's all yours. And that closet." He walked over and pulled open double doors, revealing a walk-in closet bigger than some apartments. "We'll get you some new clothes tomorrow." Lily's eyes darted around the room again, settling on a framed abstract painting on the wall. "I usually sleep on a mattress on the floor," she said quietly. "At Grandma's." Frank's chest tightened. He'd known she'd been living in poverty, but hearing it straight from her made it real in a way the knowledge hadn't been before. "Well, you've got a proper bed now," he said gruffly, trying to hide how much her words affected him. Maria appeared in the doorway, her arms full of fresh towels. "I've stocked the bathroom," she said warmly. "And there are some basic toiletries in there, too. We can get anything else you need tomorrow." Lily nodded, still looking lost in the massive room. She placed her backpack carefully on a velvet ottoman, the worn fabric a stark contrast to the luxury around it. "Dinner's at 6, Frank said, checking his watch. "Maria makes the best lasagna in town." Another quiet nod from Lily. Frank shifted uncomfortably, wanting to say more, but not knowing what. He watched as Lily unzipped her backpack and pulled out a worn teddy bear, placing it gently on the bed. That's a nice bear," he attempted. "Mom gave it to me," Lily said softly, smoothing the bear's matted fur. "Before she died." The words hung heavy in the air. Frank cleared his throat, fighting the urge to flee from this emotional moment. "I'll let you get settled," he managed. "If you need anything, Marie is usually in the kitchen, and I'll be in my study." Later that evening, after a mostly silent dinner where Lily barely touched her food, Frank sat in his leather chair in his study. The glass of whiskey in his hand caught the light from his desk lamp, casting amber shadows on the wood paneling. He could hear faint footsteps above, Lily exploring her new room, probably. Every step reminded him of his inadequacy. What did he know about raising a kid? About being a father? He'd missed 12 years of her life, and now he was expecting her to adapt to this completely different world overnight. Frank took a long sip of his whiskey, the familiar burn doing nothing to ease the knot in his stomach. He'd given her a room full of expensive furniture and fancy gadgets, but what she really needed was a father, and he had no idea how to be one. Frank stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Lily pick at her breakfast. She sat hunched over a bowl of cereal, her shoulders tense. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows made her look even smaller, more fragile. So Frank cleared his throat, moving to sit across from her. "Must be different from what you're used to." Lily's spoon clinked against the bowl as she stirred the now soggy cereal. "Yeah," she mumbled, not looking up. Frank drummed his fingers on the marble countertop, searching for words. "Your grandmother? She took care of you all this time?" "After Mom died." Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. She pushed her cereal bowl away, still mostly full. "Rebecca." Frank said the name softly, memories flooding back. "Your mother. She was a good woman." For the first time that morning, Lily looked up at him. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, held a mix of pain and anger. "She worked 2 jobs," she said. "Sometimes 3. Grandma said she got sick because she worked too hard." The accusation in her voice was clear. Frank's chest tightened. "I didn't know," he said. "If I had known." "She tried to tell you." Lily's words came out sharp, cutting through the morning quiet. "Grandma said Mom called and called, but you never answered." Frank remembered those years after he left, the ignored calls, the unopened letters. He'd been too caught up in his own pain, his own mistakes. I was different then," he managed. "Mom used to show me pictures," Lily continued, her voice catching. "She kept them in a box under her bed. She said you used to laugh a lot, that you were kind." She paused, studying his tattooed arms, his hard expression. "You don't look kind now." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He watched as Lily pushed her chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. "Can I go to my room?" "We're not done talking," Frank said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "Please." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to talk anymore. About Mom or Grandma or anything." Maria, who had been quietly washing dishes, turned around. "Let her go, Mr. Lawson," she said gently. "She's had enough for now." Frank wanted to object, to keep Lily there, to somehow make her understand. But the pain in her face stopped him. He nodded, and Lily fled the kitchen, her footsteps echoing up the stairs. "Damn it," Frank muttered, running a hand through his hair. He stood up abruptly, pacing the kitchen. "How am I supposed to help her if she won't even talk to me?" Maria dried her hands on a dish towel, watching him with understanding eyes. "You'll never get to her by force," she said quietly. "You have to give her time." Frank stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. "Time," he repeated. "I've already wasted 12 years." Maria stepped closer, her voice firm but kind. "Then don't waste any more by pushing too hard, too fast. She's hurting, Mr. Lawson. Let her heal at her own pace." Frank looked up at the ceiling, imagining Lily in her too-big room, surrounded by luxury, but feeling more alone than ever. He nodded slowly, accepting Maria's wisdom, even as his heart ached with the weight of all his mistakes. The rumble of a motorcycle echoed through the estate's grounds, making Frank's head snap up from his paperwork. He knew that sound, the distinctive growl of a custom Harley-Davidson. Through his study window, he watched a familiar figure roll up the driveway, leather jacket gleaming in the afternoon sun. Tom the Wolf Morales hadn't changed much. His salt and pepper beard was a bit longer, the lines around his eyes deeper, but he still carried himself with that predatory grace that had earned him his nickname. Frank's jaw tightened as he walked to the front door. He hadn't seen Tom since leaving the club, and his old friend's unexpected visit set off warning bells. Well, Tom called out, pulling off his riding gloves. "Look what domestication does to a man." His eyes swept over Frank's button-down shirt and pressed slacks. "Trading in your cuts for designer threads now. What are you doing here, Tom?" Frank's voice was low, careful. Tom spread his arms wide, a wolfish grin spreading across his weathered face. "Can't a man check on an old friend? Word gets around, you know. Heard you've got yourself a kid now." Frank's shoulders tensed. "Leave it alone, Tom. Leave it alone." Tom laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "You're Frank, Hell's Fury Lawson, the man who once took on 3 rival clubs single-handedly. Now look at you, playing house with some little girl." "She's my daughter," Frank growled. "She's your weakness." Tom shot back, stepping closer. "You think you could just erase who you are? What we did, the blood we spilled together." He gestured at the mansion. "All this fancy shit doesn't change what's in your veins, brother." From upstairs, a door closed. Both men looked up to see Lily watching them through an upstairs window. She quickly disappeared behind the curtain. Tom's grin widened. "Sweet kid. Be ashamed if she found out what her daddy really is. The things you've done." Frank's fists clenched. "That's enough." "Is it?" Tom's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You really think you can be what she needs? That you can play the respectable father? We both know better. Men like us, we don't change. We just pretend until the mask cracks." "I'm not that person anymore," Frank said, but the words fell hollow even to him. "Sure you're not." Tom pulled his gloves back on. "But when that little girl looks at you with those innocent eyes, remember who you really are. Remember the bodies we buried, the deals we made." He swung his leg over his bike. "You can't escape your past, Frank. It's in your blood, just like the ink on your skin." The motorcycle roared to life, and Tom gave Frank one last knowing look. "Don't let her make you soft, brother. In our world, soft gets you killed." Frank stood in the driveway long after Tom's bike disappeared down the road. The tattoos under his shirt seemed to burn, reminders of promises made in blood, of a brotherhood he'd sworn would last forever. He touched the skull inked on his forearm, remembering the night he'd gotten it, celebrating their first successful run. Looking up at Lily's window, Frank felt the weight of 2 worlds pulling him apart. In one direction lay the familiar darkness of his past, the intoxicating freedom of living by his own rules. In the other, a chance at redemption through the eyes of a daughter he barely knew. For the first time since Lily had entered his life, Frank felt truly lost between who he was and who he needed to be. The afternoon sun streamed through the dining room windows as Lily sat at the massive oak table, carefully opening an envelope with shaking hands. Frank stood in the doorway, his large frame casting a shadow across the polished floor. He watched as his daughter's eyes moved across the paper, her expression changing from excitement to something more complex. "It's from Grandma," Lily said softly, her fingers tracing the edges of the letter. The paper looked worn, as if it had been written, folded, and unfolded several times before being sent. Frank shifted uncomfortably, his tattooed arms crossed over his chest. He'd never met Rebecca's mother, but he knew enough about her to understand the complicated feelings this letter might bring. "She misses me," Lily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She says the house is too quiet now." A small smile tugged at her lips, but there was sadness in her eyes. Frank moved closer, his heavy boots quiet against the carpet. "What else does she say?" Lily's hands tightened on the paper. "She wants me to visit." She paused, glancing up at Frank. She says she doesn't understand why I'm staying here with." Her voice trailed off. "With me," Frank finished for her, his throat tight. He could imagine the words on that paper, the judgment, the anger, the accusations. He deserved them all. "She's not mean about it," Lily rushed to add, but Frank could see the conflict in her face. "She just doesn't know you." Maria appeared in the doorway with a plate of cookies, her timing perfect as always. She set them down near Lily and gave Frank a meaningful look before quietly leaving the room. "Do you want to see her?" Frank asked, pulling out a chair and sitting down. The furniture seemed too delicate for his bulk, but he'd learned to be gentle with things in his home since Lily arrived. Lily nodded, then stopped, then nodded again. "Yes, but—" She looked at Frank, her eyes full of worry. "I don't want to hurt your feelings." Frank felt something crack inside his chest. This child, who had every right to be angry with him, was worried about his feelings. He reached across the table, his large hand stopping short of touching hers. "Your grandmother raised you when I wasn't there," he said, the words rough but honest. "She loved you when I should have been loving you. You have every right to want to see her." Lily's shoulders relaxed slightly. Would you take me?" Frank's first instinct was to say no, to protect himself from the confrontation that would surely come. But he looked at Lily's hopeful face and knew he couldn't refuse. "Of course I will," he said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. "We can go this weekend if you'd like." Lily's face lit up, but then doubt crept back in. "Are you sure? Grandma might not be very nice to you." Frank managed a small smile. "I'm a big guy. I can handle it." Lily giggled, and the sound made the decision worth it. She carefully folded the letter and held it close to her chest. "Thank you, Dad." It was the first time she called him that, and Frank had to look away to hide the emotion on his face. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll make the arrangements. We'll leave Saturday morning." The small yellow house sat nestled between overgrown rose bushes, its paint peeling slightly at the edges. Frank's expensive SUV looked out of place in the modest neighborhood, drawing curious glances from nearby homes. As they walked up the cracked concrete path, Lily bounced on her toes, excited despite the tension radiating from Frank. The screen door creaked open before they reached it. Margaret Shin stood in the doorway, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a floral apron that had seen better days. Her eyes immediately found Lily, lighting up with joy, but when they shifted to Frank, they turned cold as ice. "Grandma!" Lily rushed forward, throwing herself into Margaret's waiting arms. "Oh, my sweet girl." Margaret's voice cracked as she held Lily tight. "I've missed you so much." She pressed her face into Lily's hair, and Frank saw the same gesture Rebecca used to make. Frank hung back, his large frame making him feel even more out of place on the small porch. Margaret finally looked up at him, her arms still around Lily. "Mr. Lawson," she said stiffly. "Mrs. Chun," Frank responded, his voice gruff with discomfort. The inside of the house was exactly what Frank expected, modest but immaculately clean, with photos covering every available surface. His chest tightened as he spotted Rebecca's face in several of them, her smile forever frozen in time. "I made your favorite lunch," Margaret told Lily, leading them to a small dining room. "Those dumplings you always loved." The table was already set with 3 places, though Frank noticed his setting was slightly apart from the others. The message wasn't subtle. "Thank you, Grandma," Lily said, settling into her familiar spot. "I haven't had your dumplings in so long." Frank lowered himself carefully onto the delicate wooden chair, feeling like a bear trying to sit at a dollhouse table. The silence was thick as Margaret brought out steaming plates of food. "So," Margaret said, her tone sharp despite her attempt at politeness, "how are you finding life in that big mansion, Lily?" "It's different," Lily answered carefully, glancing between her grandmother and Frank. "But Dad's been really nice to me." Margaret's chopsticks clattered against her plate. "Dad," she repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "That's a new development." Frank kept his eyes on his plate, pushing the food around without eating. He could feel the weight of years of anger directed at him. "Would you help me with the tea, Lily?" Margaret asked suddenly. "In the kitchen?" But when Lily stood up, Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. "Actually, Frank, would you help me instead?" Frank followed Margaret into the small kitchen, having to turn sideways to fit through the narrow doorway. She busied herself with the kettle for a moment before turning to face him. "You abandoned them," she said without preamble, her voice low but sharp. "Rebecca tried to tell you about Lily. She called you for months after she found out she was pregnant, but you were too busy with your motorcycles and your gang to care." Frank stood silent, each word hitting him like a physical blow. "She cried herself to sleep so many nights," Margaret continued, her hands gripping the counter. "She waited for you to come back, to be the man she thought you could be. She died, still believing you might change." The kettle whistled, its shrill sound filling the heavy silence between them. Frank could hear Lily humming to herself in the dining room, oblivious to the confrontation in the kitchen. He accepted every word Margaret said, knowing he deserved each one. While the muffled voices of Frank and her grandmother drifted from the kitchen, Lily wandered through the familiar halls of the small house. Her fingers traced the wooden picture frames that lined the walls, each one holding a precious memory. She knew these photos by heart: her first day of school, her 6th birthday party, countless moments with her mother. But today something caught her eye. In a dusty corner of the living room, partially hidden behind a potted plant, sat a frame she'd never noticed before. Lily carefully picked it up, wiping away the thin layer of dust with her sleeve. Her breath caught in her throat. There, frozen in time, stood her mother, young, beautiful, and radiant, next to a man she barely recognized as Frank. This Frank was different from the intimidating figure in the kitchen. His face was softer, younger, and his smile reached his eyes. He had fewer tattoos then, and his arm was wrapped protectively around Rebecca's waist. They stood in front of a motorcycle, and her mother wore a leather jacket that was clearly too big for her, probably Frank's. But it was their eyes that held Lily's attention. The way they looked at each other spoke of something deep and real. Her mother's eyes sparkled with joy, and Frank's face showed none of the hardness it carried now. They looked in love. Lily's fingers trembled as she held the frame. Questions bubbled up inside her. What had happened to change things so dramatically? Why had Frank left? How could someone who looked at her mother with such love just disappear? That was taken at the county fair. Lily jumped at her grandmother's voice behind her. She hadn't heard her approach. "Your mother loved that jacket," Margaret continued softly. "She kept it for years after he left." Lily's throat felt tight. Did she still love him? Even after? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Your mother's heart was too big for her own good sometimes. In the kitchen, Lily could hear Frank moving around, the floorboards creaking under his weight. She looked back at the photo, at the happiness captured there, and felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't understand," Lily whispered, her voice shaking. She walked toward the kitchen, still clutching the photograph. Frank looked up as she entered, his expression changing when he saw what she held. "I found this," she said, holding up the frame. "You both look so happy here." "What?" Her voice cracked. "Why did you leave us? Did you not want me?" Did you not love Mom anymore? Frank's face crumpled with pain. He took a step toward her, but stopped, unsure if she would welcome his comfort. Lily, he said, his gruff voice unusually gentle. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but none of them had anything to do with not wanting you or not loving your mother. Then why? The tears were flowing freely now. Why weren't you there when I needed a dad? When Mom got sick? When she... Lily couldn't finish the sentence. Frank moved closer, kneeling down to her level. His massive frame seemed smaller somehow, humbled by her pain. I was young and stupid, he said. I thought I needed freedom more than family. I was wrong, so wrong. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll let me. Lily looked down at the photo again, at the happy couple who had no idea what the future held. Her tears fell onto the glass, blurring the image. Frank sank into the worn floral armchair, the old springs creaking under his weight. The photograph trembled in Lily's small hands as she stood before him, her eyes red and puffy from crying. The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor of her grandmother's house. Come here, kiddo, Frank said softly, patting the ottoman next to his chair. His voice, usually gruff and commanding, was gentle now. Lily hesitated for a moment before sitting down, still clutching the photograph like a shield. I've spent years running from my mistakes, Frank began, running a hand through his graying hair. But seeing that picture, seeing how happy your mother and I were. He paused, swallowing hard. It brings it all back. Lily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Were you different then? Frank nodded slowly. I was younger, sure, but that's no excuse. I thought I had it all figured out. The freedom of the road, my biker friends, the thrill of living wild. He gestured to his tattoo-covered arms. Each of these tells a story, but not one I'm proud of anymore. Mom never said bad things about you, Lily whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the picture frame. Even when I asked, she'd just get quiet and say you had your reasons. Frank's chest tightened. Your mother was too good for me. I knew it then, and I know it now. When she told me she was pregnant, he closed his eyes, the memory painful. I panicked. The gang was everything to me back then. They were my family, or so I thought. I convinced myself I wasn't ready for a real family. Did I mess it up? But you messed it up by leaving, Lily said, her voice barely audible. Yeah, I did. Frank leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. That's the thing about running away from your problems. They just get bigger while you're gone. I missed everything. Your first steps, your first words. His voice cracked. I miss being there when your mother needed me most. Lily's lower lip quivered. She called for you, you know, when she was sick. She'd get confused sometimes and ask where you were. Frank felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He reached out, hesitantly, and took Lily's small hand in his large, calloused one. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. I can't change the past, Lily. God knows I wish I could. But I'm here now, and I want to do right by you. Not because I have to, but because... He struggled to find the right words. Because when I look at you, I see all the good that was in your mother. I see the family I threw away, and I want a chance to make things right. Lily's eyes filled with fresh tears. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Frank. I just want... She took a shaky breath. I just want you to love me. Not because you feel bad or because you have to. I want you to love me for real. Frank felt his own eyes growing wet. I already do, kiddo. I already do. He could see the war of emotions on Lily's face. Hope fighting with fear, longing battling with hurt. She needed more than just words, he knew. She needed time and proof and patience. I promise you, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion, I will spend every day showing you that I mean it. No more running. No more mistakes. Just us, figuring this out together. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees at Jefferson Park, scattering golden leaves across the worn wooden bench where Frank and Lily sat. They'd walked here after their emotional talk at her grandmother's house, both needing fresh air and open space. Frank bought them both hot chocolate from a nearby vendor, and Lily wrapped her small hands around the paper cup, savoring its warmth. The park was quiet this late afternoon, with only a few dog walkers and joggers passing by. Your mom loved this park, Frank said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. We used to come here all the time when we were dating. Lily looked up at him, curiosity replacing the usual guardedness in her eyes. Really? She never told me that. Frank nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. See that old carousel over there? He pointed to the vintage merry-go-round across the playground. That's where I first met her. I was fixing my motorcycle nearby, and she was watching the kids ride. She had the most beautiful laugh. Mom always laughed a lot, Lily said, her voice warming with the memory. Even when things were hard, she tried to find something funny. That was Rebecca, all right. Frank took a sip of his hot chocolate. She could light up any room she walked into. Made everyone feel special, you know. Lily nodded, pulling her knees up to her chest. She used to sing me silly songs when I couldn't sleep. Made up the words as she went along. The Banana Phone song? Frank asked, chuckling. Lily's eyes widened. You know that one? Know it? I helped write it. Frank grinned. We made it up one rainy afternoon when the power went out. Your mom grabbed a banana from the kitchen and pretended it was a phone. For the first time since they'd met, Lily giggled. The sound made Frank's heart skip a beat. It was exactly like Rebecca's laugh. Tell me more, Lily said, shifting closer to him on the bench. What else did you and Mom do? Frank spent the next hour sharing stories about Rebecca. Their first date at the county fair, how she always put too much sugar in her coffee, the way she'd dance in the kitchen while cooking. With each story, he could see Lily's walls coming down just a little more. She wanted to be a teacher, you know, Frank said, watching a pair of squirrels chase each other around a tree trunk. Always talked about opening her own preschool someday. She did teach, Lily said proudly. She volunteered at my school before she got sick. The kids loved her. Frank felt the familiar pang of regret, but this time it was mixed with pride. That sounded just like her, always following her dreams, no matter what. Lily was quiet for a moment, drawing patterns in the condensation on her empty cup. Sometimes I'm afraid I'll forget things about her. Little things like how her perfume smelled or the way she tucked me in at night. Frank hesitated, then gently put his arm around Lily's shoulders. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. That's why we need to keep talking about her, kiddo. Keep her memory alive together. Lily looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Without warning, she turned and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his jacket. Frank froze for a moment, then carefully returned the hug, holding his daughter close. Isn't that what we want for our children? Parents who keep trying, who face their mistakes, who work to be better. That's exactly what Frank Lawson is doing. James returned to his seat, and the judge, a stern-faced woman with silver-rimmed glasses, looked at her watch. We'll take a 15-minute recess before I deliver my decision, she announced, her voice firm but neutral. The sharp crack of her gavel made Frank jump slightly. As people began to move around the courtroom, Frank remained seated, his heart hammering in his chest. Everything hung in the balance now. His relationship with Lily, their future together, his chance at redemption. He glanced at his daughter, who caught his eye briefly before looking away. The next 15 minutes would feel like an eternity. Frank closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself for whatever was coming. All he could do now was wait and hope that the judge would see beyond his past to the father he was desperately trying to become. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. All rise. Court is now in session. Frank stumbled to his feet, his legs feeling like lead. The 15-minute recess had felt like hours, each second ticking by with excruciating slowness. He reached for Lily's hand without thinking, and to his surprise, she didn't pull away. Her small fingers trembled in his large, callous palm. Judge Margaret Wilson settled into her chair, adjusting her glasses as she surveyed the courtroom. Her face remained neutral, giving no hint of her decision. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of papers and the occasional creaking of wooden benches. In the matter of custody regarding Lily Lawson, Judge Wilson began, her voice steady and clear. I have carefully considered all evidence presented before this court. She paused, looking directly at both Frank and Eleanor Matthews. This has been a particularly challenging case, as it involves not just the question of legal custody, but the deeper matters of redemption and second chances. Frank's grip on Lily's hand tightened slightly. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, each word from the judge making his chest tighter. Mrs. Matthews has provided exemplary care for Lily during extremely difficult circumstances, the judge continued. Her dedication to her granddaughter's well-being is beyond question. Eleanor straightened in her chair, a flicker of hope crossing her face. However, Judge Wilson continued, this court must also consider the rights of a biological parent who has demonstrated genuine effort to reform and establish a meaningful relationship with their child. She turned her attention to Frank. Mr. Lawson's past is troubling, there's no denying that. But the evidence shows significant changes in his life and sincere attempts to become the father his daughter needs. Frank felt Lily's hand squeeze his ever so slightly. He didn't dare look at her, afraid his emotions would overwhelm him. The purpose of family court is not to punish past mistakes, but to determine what serves the best interest of the child. Judge Wilson removed her glasses, her expression softening slightly. In this case, I believe Lily's best interest lies in maintaining strong relationships with both her grandmother and her father. The judge picked up her gavel. Therefore, it is the decision of this court to grant joint custody to both parties. Mr. Lawson and Mrs. Matthews will share legal custody of Lily, with physical custody divided according to the schedule outlined in the proposed parenting plan. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. Frank stood frozen, barely processing the words he'd just heard. Joint custody. They'd won. He turned to Lily, tears welling in his eyes. Lily looked up at him, her own eyes glistening. For a moment, they just stared at each other, neither quite sure what to do. Then, as if moved by the same impulse, they fell into each other's arms. Frank held his daughter close, feeling her small frame shake with quiet sobs against his chest. His own tears fell freely now, dropping onto Lily's dark hair. I promise, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, I promise I'll be better. I'll be the father you deserve. Lily's arms tightened around him in response, and in that embrace, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The warmth of hope, the weight of responsibility, and the pure, overwhelming joy of love. The evening sun cast long shadows across the driveway as Frank's car pulled up to the mansion. The familiar side of the grand house looked different somehow, warmer, more like a home than the cold fortress it had been for so many years. Frank cut the engine and sat for a moment, his hand still on the steering wheel. Beside him, Lily fiddled with the zipper of her jacket, her eyes fixed on the house. The courtroom victory still felt surreal to both of them, like a dream they might wake up from at any moment. Well, Frank said, his voice gruff with emotion, we're home. The word home felt different now, carrying a weight it hadn't before. Maria stood waiting at the top of the steps, her kind face beaming. She'd been more than just a housekeeper through all of this. She'd been their anchor, keeping things steady when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Welcome home, mi amor, Maria called out to Lily as they climbed the steps. She opened her arms, and Lily walked into them, accepting the warm embrace. Frank watched the interaction, grateful for Maria's presence in their lives. Inside, the mansion felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, warming the hardwood floors. Frank's heavy boots echoed through the foyer as he followed Lily and Maria toward the kitchen. I made your favorite, Maria announced, lifting the lid off a pot. The rich aroma of her famous chicken soup filled the air. I thought we could all use some comfort food today. Lily's face lit up. During her time here, Maria's cooking had become one of her favorite things about living in the mansion. She climbed onto one of the bar stools at the kitchen island, her feet swinging slightly above the floor. Frank leaned against the counter, watching as Maria ladled the soup into bowls. The tension that had been building for weeks seemed to melt away with each passing minute. The courthouse, the arguments, the fear, it all felt distant now. They stayed like that for a long while, the autumn sun warming their backs, sharing in their love for the woman they both lost and the connection they were finally beginning to find. Frank sat at his mahogany desk, sorting through the morning mail. Most of it was business correspondence, contracts, invoices, the usual paperwork that kept his empire running. But one cream-colored envelope caught his eye. The return address belonged to Morrison & Associates, a law firm he didn't recognize. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, an unfamiliar sense of dread settling in his stomach. The letterhead was crisp and professional, the words beneath it anything but comforting. Dear Mr. Lawson, we represent Mrs. Eleanor Matthews in the matter of custody regarding her granddaughter, Lily Lawson. The words blurred before his eyes. Frank had to blink several times to focus on the rest of the letter. His throat went dry as he read further, each paragraph hitting him like a physical blow. The letter detailed a lengthy list of accusations: his criminal past, his association with biker gangs, his absence from Lily's life, his sudden and suspicious interest in custody. Eleanor Matthews, Lily's grandmother, was filing for full custody, claiming Frank was an unfit parent who posed a danger to Lily's well-being. This can't be happening, Frank muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. He'd been making progress with Lily. Just yesterday, they'd shared that moment in the park, talking about Rebecca. For the first time, he felt like a real father. The sound of Lily's laughter drifted in through the study window. She was outside with Maria, tending to the small garden they'd started together. Frank stood and walked to the window, watching his daughter carefully plant flower bulbs in the rich soil. She looked happy, peaceful even, his hands clenched into fists, crumpling the letter. He wouldn't lose her. Not now. Not when they were finally connecting. Frank grabbed his phone and called his business lawyer, James Parker. I need you in my office. Now. 30 minutes later, James sat across from Frank, reviewing the custody suit. His expression grew grimmer with each page he turned. Frank, this is serious. Very serious. They can't take her, Frank growled, pacing the study like a caged animal. She's my daughter. A daughter you didn't know existed until a few weeks ago, James pointed out. And your past, well, it's not exactly going to help your case. Frank stopped pacing. What are you saying? James sighed, setting down the papers. I'm saying this is going to be a battleground, Frank. They're going to drag everything into the light. Your time with the Hells Angels, your criminal record, your business dealings. Every skeleton in your closet will be paraded through that courtroom. I don't care about that, Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. I care about Lily. The court cares about what's best for Lily, James countered. And they're going to look at your history versus a grandmother who's been there since day one, who raised her after Rebecca died, who's been stable, present, and what? Frank demanded. Better than me. James met his eyes steadily. That's what we'll have to fight against. The perception that you're still that same man from your past, that you're unfit to be a father. Frank sank into his chair, the weight of reality crushing down on him. Everything he'd done, every mistake he'd made, it was all coming back to haunt him, and now it might cost him his daughter. The courthouse loomed before Frank like a mountain of stone and judgment. Its imposing columns and heavy wooden doors seemed to mock him, reminding him of every mistake he'd made. He adjusted his tie for the 100th time that morning, the unfamiliar fabric feeling like a noose around his neck. You ready? James asked, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. The lawyer looked sharp in his tailored suit, a stark contrast to Frank's uncomfortable formal wear. Frank nodded, unable to find his voice. His palms were sweating, and his heart thundered in his chest. He'd faced down rival gangs without flinching, built a business empire from nothing. But this terrified him more than anything. They climbed the courthouse steps together, their footsteps echoing in the morning quiet. Maria walked beside them, holding Lily's hand. The girl wore a navy blue dress that made her look even smaller than usual. Her dark hair was neatly braided, and her eyes were wide with uncertainty. Inside, the marble halls felt cold and sterile. Their footsteps clicked against the polished floor as they made their way to Courtroom C. Other people milled about, lawyers in sharp suits, court officers in uniforms, civilians looking just as lost as Frank felt. Remember what we discussed, James said quietly as they waited outside the courtroom. Stay calm, no matter what they say about your past. Let me handle the talking. And Frank. He caught Frank's eye. Don't let them see you sweat. Frank managed a tight nod. His eyes drifted to Lily, who sat on a nearby bench, her legs swinging nervously. She looked so vulnerable, so young. How had he missed so many years of her life? The courtroom doors opened, and people began filing in. Frank spotted Eleanor Matthews, Lily's grandmother, entering with her lawyer. She wore a conservative dress and carried herself with dignity, but her eyes were cold when they met Frank's. "It's time," James said, gathering his papers. They entered the courtroom, the smell of wood polish and anxiety thick in the air. Frank's boots felt heavy on the carpeted floor as he made his way to the defendant's table. Lily sat beside him, her small frame tense. "You okay, kiddo?" Frank whispered. Lily nodded, but her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "I'm scared," she admitted in a tiny voice. Frank wanted to reach out, to hold her hand, to tell her everything would be okay. But he wasn't sure if he was allowed to, wasn't sure of anything anymore. Instead, he said softly, "Me too." James leaned over, his voice barely audible. "Stay strong, Frank. We can't afford to lose this case. Everything depends on how you present yourself today." The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge, Sarah Martinez, presiding. Everyone stood as the judge entered, her black robes sweeping behind her. She took her seat, her expression neutral as she surveyed the courtroom. Frank turned slightly in his chair, looking back at Lily. Her face was pale, but there was something in her eyes, hope, maybe, or trust. In that moment, he made a silent promise to her. He would fight for her with everything he had. He wouldn't let her down. Not again. Not ever again. Calling the case of Matthews versus Lawson, the judge announced, her voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Eleanor Matthews took the stand. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her hands were folded carefully in her lap. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had raised a child alone. "I've been there for Lily since the day she was born," Eleanor said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "When Rebecca passed away, I was the one who held that little girl while she cried. I was there for every scraped knee, every nightmare, every parent-teacher conference." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Where was Mr. Lawson during all of this? Frank's shoulders tensed. Each word felt like a knife to his heart, but he forced himself to stay still, remembering his lawyer's advice. "And now," Eleanor continued, "after 12 years of absence, he thinks he can just walk into her life? Based on what? A DNA test?" She shook her head. "Being a father is more than biology. It's about being there day after day through the hard times and the good times." Frank watched as Eleanor's lawyer guided her through more testimony. She spoke about Frank's past with the biker gang, his criminal record from his younger days, the way he'd abandoned Rebecca. With each word, Frank felt the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. When it was James's turn to cross-examine, he approached Eleanor carefully. "Mrs. Matthews, would you agree that people can change?" "Of course," Eleanor replied stiffly. "And would you agree that Mr. Lawson has shown considerable effort to provide for Lily since discovering her existence?" "Material provisions aren't everything," Eleanor countered. "That child needs stability, love, guidance." After Eleanor stepped down, several character witnesses took the stand. They painted contrasting pictures of Frank, some speaking of his business success and recent charitable works, others dwelling on his troubled past. Finally, it was Frank's turn to testify. His palms were sweating as he made his way to the witness stand. The wood creaked beneath him as he settled into the chair, and he had to remind himself to breathe. "Mr. Lawson," James began, "please tell the court about your relationship with Lily." Frank's throat felt dry. He glanced at Lily, who sat watching him with those big brown eyes, Rebecca's eyes. His voice came out rough at first, then steadied as he spoke. "I know I've made mistakes," he said, "more than I can count. I was young and stupid when I left Rebecca. I thought I was too wild, too broken to be any good as a husband or father." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong, so wrong." The courtroom was silent now, every eye fixed on him. Frank continued, his voice shaking slightly. "I missed 12 years of my daughter's life. 12 years I can never get back. I wasn't there when she took her first steps or said her first words. I wasn't there when she lost her mother. His voice cracked on the last word. I can't change the past, but I'm here now, and I want to be the father she deserves. Not because some DNA test says I have to, but because she's my daughter and I love her. Frank looked directly at Lily as he spoke those last words. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she held his gaze. The room had fallen completely silent, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. James Anderson rose from his chair, straightening his tie as he approached the bench. His footsteps echoed in the hushed courtroom. Frank sat rigid in his chair, hands clasped tightly together, watching his lawyer prepare to deliver the closing argument. Your Honor, James began, his voice steady and clear, we've heard a lot about Frank Lawson's past today. Yes, he was a member of a motorcycle gang. Yes, he made poor choices in his youth. And yes, he wasn't there for his daughter's early years. He paused, letting the admission sink in. But this case isn't about who Frank Lawson was. It's about who he is now and who he's trying to become. Frank watched as James moved closer to the jury box, his manner relaxed but purposeful. The law recognizes that people can change. That's why we have rehabilitation programs, why we offer second chances. Mr. Lawson has transformed himself from a troubled young man into a successful businessman who gives back to his community. Eleanor Matthews shifted in her seat, her face taut with disapproval. James continued, but more importantly, since discovering Lily's existence, Mr. Lawson has shown genuine dedication to becoming the father she needs. He's provided her with a stable home, enrolled her in school, and most crucially, he's working to build a real relationship with her. James picked up a folder from his table. We've submitted evidence of Mr. Lawson's involvement in Lily's life over the past months. Regular meetings with her teachers, attendance at her school events, family therapy sessions. These aren't the actions of someone playing at being a father. They're the actions of a man committed to genuine change. Frank's throat tightened as he watched Lily from the corner of his eye. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, just like her grandmother had taught her. Your Honor, James continued, his voice softening. We're not asking the court to forget Mr. Lawson's past. We're asking the court to recognize his present efforts and his potential for the future. This isn't just about Frank Lawson's right to be a father. It's about Lily's right to know and build a relationship with her father. James turned to face Eleanor. Mrs. Matthews has done an admirable job raising Lily, and no one is suggesting that should change. We're simply asking for the opportunity for Lily to have both her loving grandmother and her father in her life. Joint custody would give Lily the benefit of both these important relationships. The lawyer's final words rang through the courtroom. Your Honor, redemption isn't just a concept, it's a journey. Frank Lawson is on that journey. He's not perfect, but he's trying. And, Frank said, clearing his throat, we should celebrate. He looked at Lily, trying to read her expression. Maybe we could order that pizza you like? The one with the stuffed crust. A small smile tugged at the corners of Lily's mouth. Can we eat in the living room? She asked cautiously. Maybe watch a movie? Frank chuckled, remembering how he'd once been strict about keeping food in the dining room. Yeah, kiddo, we can eat in the living room. Maria busied herself with calling the pizza place while Frank and Lily moved to the formal dining room. The large table that had hosted so many lonely meals now felt different with Lily sitting across from him, blowing on her soup to cool it down. Dad, Lily said quietly, testing out the word. It was the first time she'd called him that. Frank's heart skipped a beat. He looked up, trying to keep his voice steady. Yeah. Thank you, she said, stirring her soup. For fighting for me. Frank had to swallow hard before he could respond. Always, Lily. I'll always fight for you. A genuine laugh bubbled up from Lily as she took another spoonful of soup. Even if Grandma makes you crazy? Even then, Frank smiled, feeling the last of the tension dissolve. Even then, their laughter filled the dining room, echoing off the high ceilings. It was a sound Frank hadn't heard in his house for years, and now he couldn't imagine the place without it. The silence that had once defined his home was gone, replaced by something much better, the sound of family. The pizza boxes lay empty on the coffee table, and the credits of their movie rolled across the TV screen. Frank watched as Lily stretched and yawned, clearly tired from the emotional day they'd had. The evening light was starting to fade, casting long shadows through the living room windows. "Hey," Frank said softly, turning to face his daughter. "Can we talk for a minute?" Lily nodded, pulling her feet up under her on the couch. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than she had in the courthouse earlier. Frank took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I know these past few months haven't been easy. For either of us." He ran a hand through his graying hair, the tattoos on his arm visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "But I want you to know something important." Lily watched him with those eyes that reminded him so much of Rebecca. Frank's heart ached with the memory of her mother, but it also filled him with determination. "I made a lot of mistakes in my life," he continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. "The biggest one was not being there for your mother and for you." He paused, gathering his courage. "But I promise you, Lily, that's never going to happen again. I will always be here for you, no matter what." Lily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Really?" she whispered, her voice small but hopeful. "Really," Frank confirmed, reaching out to take her hand. "Look, I know I'm not perfect. I'm probably going to mess up sometimes, and there's still a lot I need to learn about being a dad. But I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me, kiddo." A small smile played at the corners of Lily's mouth. "Even when I get in trouble?" Frank chuckled. "Even then. Especially then. And when Grandma comes to visit? Even when your grandmother gives me those disapproving looks." Frank grinned, making Lily giggle. The last rays of sunlight were streaming through the windows, painting the room in warm golden hues. Frank stood up, offering his hand to Lily. "Come on, let's watch the sunset from a porch. It's beautiful this time of day." They walked out onto the wide veranda, settling into the comfortable porch swing. The evening air was cool and fresh, carrying the sweet scent of the garden Maria tended so carefully. The sky was ablaze with colors, deep oranges and pinks merging into purple as the sun descended toward the horizon. Lily leaned against Frank's side, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The simple gesture felt natural now, where once it had been awkward and uncertain. They swayed gently on the swing, watching as the sun painted the sky in ever-changing colors. Neither felt the need to speak. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with understanding rather than tension. Frank could feel Lily's steady breathing beside him, and he marveled at how this small person had changed his life so completely. The mansion behind them no longer felt like an empty shell of wealth and loneliness. Instead, it had become what it was always meant to be: a home. Their home. As the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, father and daughter sat together, at peace with each other and the path that lay ahead. The autumn breeze carried the mingled scents of cotton candy, popcorn, and caramel apples through the fairground. Frank watched as Lily's eyes darted from one colorful attraction to another, her excitement barely contained. The local fair had transformed the usually empty field into a wonderland of lights, music, and laughter. "Can we try that one?" Lily pointed to a ring toss game, her face lighting up with hope. Frank nodded, pulling out his wallet. "Sure, kiddo, but don't get your hopes up too high. These games are usually rigged." The vendor, a cheerful man with rosy cheeks, handed them 3 rings. Lily's first throw missed by a mile, making her frown. The second wasn't much better. "Here," Frank said, stepping closer. "Let me show you a trick I learned years ago." He positioned her arm just right, showing her how to flick her wrist. It's all in the follow-through. Lily's third throw landed perfectly around a bottleneck. She jumped up and down, squealing with delight as the vendor handed her a small stuffed penguin. They made their way through the crowd, stopping at various food stands. Frank bought them both corn dogs and fresh lemonade. As they sat on a nearby bench, he noticed how different everything felt. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for years seemed lighter somehow. "Dad," Lily asked between bites, the words still new and precious between them. "Can we go on a Ferris wheel?" Frank hesitated, eyeing the towering ride. Heights had never been his thing, but the hopeful look in Lily's eyes made his resistance crumble. "All right, but just one time." The line moved slowly, giving them time to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. When it was their turn, Frank helped Lily into the swaying cart, try to hide his nervousness. As they rose higher, Lily pressed against his side, pointing out the twinkling lights below. "Look, you can see the whole town from up here," she exclaimed. Frank forced himself to look, surprised by the beauty of the view. The fair was a sea of colored lights beneath them, and beyond that, the town spread out like a scattered collection of stars. He found himself relaxing, caught up in Lily's wonder. They tried more games after that. The balloon pop, the basketball throw, and even a strength test where Frank's mighty swing sent the bell ringing. Lily clutched her growing collection of prizes, her face glowing with happiness. At the cotton candy stand, Frank watched as Lily tried to eat the fluffy pink confection without getting it all over her face. A losing battle that made him chuckle. A couple passing by smiled at them, and for once, Frank didn't feel self-conscious about his tattoos or his imposing size. He was just a father enjoying time with his daughter. The evening passed too quickly, and soon it was time to head home. As they walked to the car, Lily's arms full of prizes and her steps growing sleepy, Frank felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just happiness, it was deeper than that. It was like finding a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. Back at the mansion, Frank helped Lily arrange her new stuffed animals on her bed. The house that had once felt so empty and cold now hummed with life and warmth. Looking around at the changed space, homework on the kitchen table, children's books on the shelves, colorful drawings stuck to the refrigerator, Frank realized he finally felt something he'd never experienced before. He felt at home. Frank stood on his mansion's back porch, his calloused hands resting on the polished wooden railing. The estate sprawled before him, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The perfectly manicured lawn, the elegant fountain, and the rows of blooming flowers all spoke of wealth and success. But for the first time, he saw beyond the material possessions. His gaze drifted to the spot where he'd first seen Lily digging through the trash. The memory no longer filled him with anger or shame. Instead, it reminded him of how far they'd come. The sound of laughter drifted through an open window. Lily was inside, probably drawing or reading one of her new books. The changes in the mansion were everywhere. Colorful throw pillows brightened the once austere living room. A bicycle leaned against the garage wall. Soccer cleats sat by the door. Little signs of life that had been missing for so long. Maria bustled past him with a basket of fresh laundry, humming softly. She caught his eye and smiled knowingly. The house had transformed from a cold sanctuary into a warm home, and everyone could feel it. Frank's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Tom, his old biker friend. He hadn't spoken to Tom since the custody hearing. The message read, "Miss the old days?" Frank stared at it for a moment before deleting it without responding. The old days were gone, and he was grateful for that. The door creaked open behind him. "Dad!" Lily's voice was soft but confident now, unlike the frightened whisper it had been weeks ago. "Can we watch the stars tonight? My science teacher says there's supposed to be a meteor shower." Frank turned to face his daughter. She wore one of the new sweaters they'd bought together, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. The sight of her still amazed him sometimes. How much she looked like Rebecca, how quickly she'd begun to trust him. "Sure thing, kiddo," he said, his gruff voice gentler than it used to be. "Let me grab some blankets." They settled into the comfortable chairs they'd placed on the lawn specifically for stargazing. The evening air was cool, but not cold, perfect for watching the sky. Frank wrapped a thick blanket around Lily's shoulders, making sure she was warm enough. "Dad," Lily asked, her eyes fixed on the darkening sky, "do you think Mom would be happy? About us?" The question caught Frank off guard. He thought about Rebecca, about all the chances he'd missed, about the years he'd wasted. But then he looked at Lily, at the second chance he'd been given, and knew the answer. "Yes, sweetheart, I think she would be." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars began to appear. Frank remembered nights spent on his motorcycle, racing through darkness, searching for something he could never find. Now, Sitting still under the vast sky with his daughter beside him, he finally felt at peace. A shooting star streaked across the sky, and Lily gasped in delight. Frank watched her face, illuminated by starlight, and felt overwhelming gratitude, not for his wealth or his success, but for this moment, for the family he was slowly rebuilding. "We'll be okay," he whispered, more to himself than to Lily. But she heard him and reached over to squeeze his hand. The gesture was small, but filled with trust and hope. Together, they watched the stars dance across the sky, both believing in the promise of tomorrow. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.